The following special episode of Addressing Gettysburg is brought to you without commercial interruption by our Patreon page. Just go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg so you can help support the show and keep it going and growing. Just go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg and help us help you. That's patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. And we thank you in advance. Now on with the show.
There we go.
Damn it, man. Why is this not opening up? Hold on here for just a second.
The button.
Is there a button? I mean, it's just seriously, that's as deep as it is.
Oh, really?
Well,
Yeah.
clip it on.
Oh, it's like for a...
Oh, wait, there it is. No, I just found it.
There you go. Okay, there.
There we go. We're good.
Tuck
Do I need to turn it on?
No, it's on. It's not hot, but it's on.
Oh, you've been working out there, Petey?
Absolutely, man. CrossFit, buddy.
All right, here's
CrossFit.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very sweet. I appreciate it. Jill, thank you so much. I really appreciate those remarks. It's very sweet. It really is true, though. This is such a team effort here. I'm glad that she acknowledged my contributions, but she's been a great friend. It's one of the best things I ever did at CWI was to hire her. We've done so many things here, not just the conference, but those students who are back there, many of them who've done internships. It's all because of Jill. So thank you so much again for that kind introduction. Yesterday, how are we doing back here? Y'all can hear me okay? Yes? We mentioned Douglas Southall Freeman and his work on Robert E. Lee and the Army in Northern Virginia. It's something that I read as a kid, even though I'm from Indiana. I was really introduced to the Civil War through the study of the Confederacy and fascinated by Lee's army. And my research continued, and I came across in the Richmond newspapers an execution that occurred in September of 1863. The largest execution in Lee's army. 10 men were killed for desertion. These 10 men were killed in front of Montpelier, James Madison's home. The accounts were lengthy, very graphic, but surprisingly, never mentioned the names of the 10 men who were killed. Never mentioned their unit as well. And then I happened to come upon this little pamphlet entitled Tragedy at Montpelier. And in this book, the author, her name is Jane Blair. Jane identified all the soldiers from the 3rd North Carolina, and one in particular stood out, his name, John Futch. John Futch was a non-slave holder. I don't believe he owned any property. He lived just above Wilmington, North Carolina. He had a wife and he had a child. He came into the Army with his brother, Charlie, and came in 1862. I won't give you his entire military record, except to say I believe he probably saw fighting at Antietam. He most certainly did at Chancellorsville. And then here at Gettysburg on the evening of July 2nd, he and Charlie were part of that evening assault against the Union right flank at Culp's Hill. John and Charlie were on the ground loading their weapons when a bullet struck Charlie in the head. John immediately knew that his brother was mortally wounded. To use John's words, he said, "I toted him off the field." And for the remainder of that night and into the next day, John was by Charlie's side. And about 1 o'clock, right when the bombardment started on July 3rd, Charlie passed. And you can only imagine John was devastated. Now, I know all those details thanks to that wonderful booklet, Tragedy at Montpelier, because the author identified and had found letters from John Futch. That's remarkable. These letters are at the State Archives in North Carolina in Raleigh. And so I proceeded to get the letters, and I believe that there are 5, possibly 7 letters from the end of the Battle of Gettysburg to the day that John Futch deserted, which was at the end of August of 1863. I unfortunately can't see from my angle, so I'll have to read from my text. You expressed a desire to know the particulars of Brother Charlie's death. I will endeavor to give them to you as well as I can. When our regiment charged the enemy's entrenchments on the heights near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, on the night of July 2nd. He was wounded on or near the top of his head. It did not pass through the brain. But I think it must have bruised them, as he did not speak after he was hit. Only God knows the bitter anguish and sad bereavement sent thrilling through my sad heart. It seems hard to part forever from those our heart treasures. Another letter describing the same moment, sent on July 19th. We marched through Pennsylvania. We had a hard fight there. We lost all of our boys nearly there. Charlie got killed and he suffered a great deal from his wound. He lived a night and a day after he was wounded. We've seen hard times there, but we got enough to eat there. But we don't now. As to myself, I get enough, for I don't want nothing to eat hardly, for I'm almost sick all the time and half crazy. I hope that we will be lifted to come home without a wound, for I have seen so many wounded and died. I stayed with Charlie until he died. He never spoke after he was wounded until he died. I never was hurt so in my life. Clearly, those two letters, not written by the same man. In fact, most of John Futch's letters resemble the July 19th missive. Little regard for spelling, grammar, or punctuation. John probably could not read or write. Jim Broomall, who's going to lead many of you on a tour with Keith Bohannon on Monday to Antietam. Jim Broomall and his wife, Tish, they were indispensable in helping me come to the conclusion that John Futch was either illiterate or semi-literate. I believe that there was a letter from Charlie early in the war in which Charlie described taking one of John's letters, passing it around the company, and everyone got a good chuckle out of it because nobody could decipher it. But John Futch, he was one of those thousands of Civil War soldiers who linguists describe as, this is a clunky academic word, ready? Transitionally literate, all right? So the man who wrote this for Futch, barely literate himself, and he had an understandable contempt for the silent E. Killed, K-I-L-D. There, T-H-E-R. Enough, N-O-U-G-H. Look at that letter again, my friends. Like his words, they splayed across the page without any regard to grammatical structure, spelling, or punctuation. I'm not going to name which daughter said this to me during the course of the week when she asked me what I was speaking upon, and I showed her this letter, and I said, look, grammar didn't matter, no punctuation, no spelling. And she said, God, they're really lucky. I wish I didn't have to worry about grammar. Kids know how to hurt their parents, don't they? So these semi-literate soldiers, they spoke their letters. They spoke their letters because they didn't spend their lives with their nose in their books. Face-to-face conversations, that's what was natural, not putting pen to paper. And it is Futch's letters that piqued my interest in the subject of semi-literate Confederates. Now, the work of Steve Berry at the University of Georgia, anything that Steve Berry writes, I'm going to read it. He's an outstanding historian, Steve Berry. Steve Berry, his work on semi-literate soldiers, very influential. He's made the point that literacy is not just one thing, that literacy, in fact, runs along a continuum. Right? You're not just literate or not literate, somewhere along the lines there. And in fact, it's illustrated by this incredible website that Steve Berry and two other professors, Michael Ellis, who is at Missouri State University, and Michael Montgomery, who's at the University of South Carolina. both linguists. These three men have collected more than 10,000 letters from semi-literate soldiers, Union as well as Confederate. Now, just a quick side note here. I hope you all will look this site up when you go into Google or your search engine of choice. If you're going to put in private voices, I encourage you to put in Civil War as well, because you will get some interesting hits if you just put private voices. This is a remarkable site. My students back here that I keep boasting about, they're waving to me right now. Hi, kids. My students, they relied heavily upon private voices. It has a search engine in which you can look up, of course, Gettysburg or any battle that interests you. And best of all the letters, they are transcribed. They're quite good. So it is well worth spending some time on private voices. But you know, most historians, they have ignored the experiences or the letters of the semi-literate. Well, why is that? Well, one thing is that these letters are scarce. They're scarce in large part because the semi-literate, they came from poor backgrounds. And these people, they're grinding it out. It was probably a luxury for them to have a box or a chest in which they would save or preserve those private letters. I also think about their homes in the South. Those homes, of course, they are not made to preserve, right, documents. Think about the heat, think about the rain, think about the humidity, and worst of all, think about, in the South, bugs, especially cockroaches, man. They're as big as armadillos in the South. It's a little bit of an exaggeration, but they're as mean as armadillos. How about that, right? And so they ravage letters, done fires as well. So it's very difficult, or it was very difficult, to preserve letters from this class of soldiers. The next thing is about the archives. The archives, which came into existence in the late 19th century and into the 20th century, those archives, they privileged the elite. They privileged the well-educated because it was the understanding in the historical community that history is made by the people in power. It's made by the people who are well-educated. A good example of that is the creation of the Southern Historical Collection, which is at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. That's the same University of North Carolina that didn't make the NCAA tournament this year. Same school. I know, that was cheap. I admit, it was cheap. J.G. Hamilton. J.G. Hamilton was a professor of history at UNC, very popular professor, a professor who was very much a defender of the lost cause interpretation of the Civil War. He wrote some books that don't see the light of day now, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, but what he did do, and what he did is of great service to the historical community today, is that when he quit teaching in 1936, he got into his Ford and he drove across the South. He visited various former plantations, prominent families, and he collected manuscript materials. And they are at the very bedrock of the Southern Historical Collection. It's amazing material, but Hamilton didn't what? He didn't care about poor folks. He certainly didn't care about black folks as well. And he's a product of his time. But that material, which again is so important to what Civil War historians do to this very day, its focus is mostly on the elites. As you all know, it's really not till 1950s, but really in the 1960s, that the historical profession starts to say, hey, wait a minute. Historical actors are not just white men who have power. We start to see that the historical process, that it is being driven by men of all classes and women and people of all racial backgrounds. That's not until the 1950s. That's not until the 1960s. That's not until historians start to think, hey, wait a minute. Poor folks, they are worth our consideration. I think another reason is, and we're all to blame for this, so I'm not just pointing the finger at historians, it's all of us in this room. Let's be honest. When we read Civil War letters, we love to read the letters of the men who are poetic, right? Who are expressive, who are descriptive. Those are the letters that we find to be compelling. I just want you to imagine for a moment the Ken Burns series. And there's David McCullough, beautiful voice that he has. or had. And he quoted letters from John Futch. Can you imagine that? It just wouldn't work, would it, right? And so we are all, in a sense, to blame because we are attracted to or drawn to these letters that are stylistic. The other reason is the questions that we have been asking, or I should say the question that we have focused on as historians when it comes to Civil War soldier experience. And that question is the question of motivation. It is certainly an important one, a significant one. But that question of motivation privileges the well-educated. And I'm going to turn now to the scholar, James McPherson. I have a great deal of respect for James McPherson. Let's make something abundantly clear. James McPherson has a Pulitzer. How many does Pete Carmichael have? 0. Not likely to get any either. Just a side note here, and you all were here, and I said such lovely things about my wife, Beth. I'm going to tell you another story, and she's not going to be happy about this. I interviewed James McPherson right here, and before that interview, I said to Beth, I said, James McPherson, Pulitzer Prize historian. I said, honey, I need an Armani suit. All right? And she said, when you get your Pulitzer, you can get your Armani suit. I was always hoping there would be an award for historians like Most Improved, right? And if I could get Most Improved, maybe I could get an Armani that way. This emphasis on motivation to be able to explore that question or that inquiry, we have we almost entirely focus on soldiers who are highly ideological, right? These semi-literate men were not that. But then the conclusion, it's one that McPherson makes, and he basically just pushes them aside because he insists that these men were not political. And which I, of course, and you'll discover here in a moment, I take issue with. So, when we turn a deaf ear to the voices of the semi-literate, we actually will silence their condemnation of war. Most Americans in the Civil War era, they believed that soldiering was an opportunity for men to fulfill or realize their Christian character. But these semi-literate soldiers, for the most part, they rejected the idea that killing made the man. So, when we compare educated soldiers to semi-literate soldiers, the following conclusions emerge. Semi-literate Confederates were more willing to admit that they were confused by war, less afraid to express emotions of fear and sorrow, more willing to reveal the dark and animalistic impulses unleashed by soldiering, and less inclined to conflate military duty with a religious obligation to God, which is, of course, redundant there. How about just with an obligation to God? And finally, and more likely to see themselves as trapped in a war in which suffering felt pointless and the killing appeared endless. So, how then was it possible for semi-literate soldiers to get underneath the romanticized side of war and to speak of the conflict as a tragedy? Well, as an educator, of course, I'm a little hesitant to say this, but it was the lack of formal education that liberated semi-literate soldiers as writers. As we know, the privilege, they sat in classrooms where they were inculcated in conventional writing practices, the rules of grammar, and taught how to write in narrative style. And in fact, if you look at their letters, they are often melodramatic narratives. They were written to inspire, and they almost always, and this is a critical point, elevated the author or the individual as having mastery over a chaotic situation like battle. The semi-literate, on the other hand, they often felt lost in the war, and they were not afraid to admit to it. They were able to admit to it, and here's where form matters. They were able to admit to it because they wrote as if they were having a face-to-face conversation with you. It is a spontaneous kind of explosion of words. Now, it's true, some of these men absolutely went inward and fell silent. But many of them broke that barrier of communication. And their letters, you can feel the urgency, and it's spelled out in jagged prose. My first example comes from Murphy Bryant. You all heard me say nice things about Keith Bohannon and the remarkable research that he has done since, I'm not exaggerating, since he was a kid. This comes from Keith Bohannon. Murphy Bryant is a member of the 11th Georgia. He was from North Georgia, and he was, I don't know if he was a slaveholder or not, but he was a teacher, and I know he had connections to the slaveholding class. He fought near the wheat field on July 2nd, and this is a letter to Huldah, his fiancée. He is writing about the wounding of his brother. He, that's referring to his brother, was by my side when he was shot. He looked around at me and smiled when he said, "Chris, I'm shot but not killed." He was in good spirits. He never said a word or opened his mouth when he was shot, only told me. Soon, the enemy reinforced and drove us back with terrible fury. I gathered my little brother up and carried him along as fast as I could, whilst it rained perfect torrents of lead and iron, and the enemy coming nearer and still nearer me. I took him safely off the field and sent him to the hospital. I would have died there with him in my arms before I would have left him there in the hands of a merciless enemy to have been bayoneted to death. Again, take in those words. Look at it once more. As you can see, Murphy's story has a natural arc and a steady rhythm that flows from his brother's wounding to the field hospital. Do you see again how he's taken the chaos of war and turned it into a coherent storyline? And look what's not there. Get the words. What would you expect to read of a man who has just emerged from something as awful as the fighting at the wheat field? Well, you expect to maybe see a little bit of blood. There is none. You expect him to admit fear. He does not. He does not admit to cowardice. He took center stage in saving his brother's life. And let's not forget, he's trying to do what? Impress his fiancée, Huldah. There's no doubt about that. Listen, I'm not suggesting to you that well-educated soldiers were not traumatized by war. What I'm trying to suggest to you is that they were actually confined as writers in ways that semi-literate soldiers were not. We'll see that. Another Keith Bohannon contribution. This is from Georgia's William Hewell. He also fought in the area of the wheat field, closer to the Rosewoods. You'll see in just a moment, his fragmented style, it just opens up his inner world. His prose, again, is jagged, and it conveys the mental disorientation of being a human target. This reading is absolutely tough going. But you would think after almost 25 years of reading undergraduate papers that I'd be well prepared to read that. Look at my students back there. They're still smiling. Don't take it personal. Here we go, all right? I got hit there above my right eye slightly. I bled right smart. I went on of the battle that evening, but I went back the next morning and lay under the shells that evening. Then we had to run about 400 yards in sight of their artillery. The shells came very thick, busting around Hughes. I heard them coming, and I would fall down and let them pass. Over there was two, went some 2 or 3 feet above my head and hit the ground some 5 or 6 feet from me. I didn't know what minute I would be struck and killed. It was right scary times. The reader can feel the sensory and emotional horrors of an artillery barrage. And it's the broken organization, right? The tortured grammar, the fractured thoughts. All of that conveys what it meant to be a man who just passed through the ordeal of battle. You see, he doesn't make any pretenses here of being in control. In fact, he admits what? That he's scared, and there's a little bit of blood there as well. A little bit more than a month after Huell wrote this letter, he died of disease in a Gordonsville, Virginia hospital. Now, we're going to shift gears just a little bit here and make the point. It didn't matter whether you were well-educated or semi-literate. All Civil War soldiers knew you're not anonymous in the Army. They all knew that their letters would likely be shared with others. Everything was public, which meant that soldiers were absolutely aware, or I should say, sensitive to how people would perceive them. And they wanted to be seen as brave. They wanted to be seen as courageous. Manliness mattered to men of all classes and of all backgrounds. But there is, in fact, a key difference. And I want to stress again that the well-educated could not help but to write idealized stories about the violence of war. They came from a world in which violence was seen as redemptive. And their formalized writing practices helped them take the squalor of soldiering and turn it into ennobling stories. Semi-literate, on the other hand, they spoke of their suffering as exploitation. And above all else, they pointed to their broken bodies to prove to the people back home that they were turning into brutes. I'm going to turn to George's Wright Vinson to illustrate this point. Wright Vinson was 20 years old when he joined the Army. He was married, he had a kid. He was not head of household. He lived on his father's farm. I don't think they had any slaves at all. The physical distance, the separation between Vinson and his wife, of course, posed all kinds of challenges, and I can't stress this enough. Again, imagine these men who had spent their entire lives speaking face to face with their friends and their family members, and now they're forced to try to communicate about what is happening to them in a very far away place. Wright, on July 5th, 1862, wrote, "Darling, if I just could see you, I could tell you a great deal. I could talk with you about things that I have seen since I left home. Dear, I have a heap to write, but I can't write it." Wright Vinson hated the Army. He wanted to get out as soon as he got in. And in fact, he thought that the only escape was the hereafter. "My life ain't no satisfaction in me, and I'd just as soon die as to live." What an admission, right? I thought Southern men were supposed to be masters of their environment, that they were supposed to control their emotions. But Wright Vinson, during his service, he spoke of his body as a piece of evidence to illustrate, to prove what the Army was doing to him, man. They were turning him into an unrecognizable thing. During a retreat in 1862, he was living off of parched corn and acorns for 2 or 3 days, and he wrote his wife, or I should say he spoke to his wife, "I got so that I could grunt like a hog." Man, he is describing himself as a barnyard animal. That's not what respectable soldiers were supposed to do. But he, Vinson, would not hide behind the facade of manliness. Man, he just spoke plainly to his wife. "I haven't washed my clothes in a month and shan't till I get soap. Everything I got is as black as a black sow. I don't reckon you'd want to see me bad with my fine suit on." Why he didn't have any soap? Because he said he couldn't afford any. "Darling, I'm ashamed to tell you that I'm lousy." We know that's lice. "If I was to get the chance to come home, you would hate to touch me, for you would get them on you, and I wouldn't have that done for $50. Dear, I can't keep them off me unless I could get soap. Kiss Charlie," his son, of course. "Kiss Charlie for me and tell him he has a father, but a sorry one." Wright Vincent's admission that he was not a worthy man, not a worthy father, is absolutely astonishing. But when we know that in 19th century, to have lice was a sign of being inferior. To not wash your body, a sign of laziness. He's defined that popular idea that Southern men must show strength, that they must, in fact, demonstrate emotional fortitude. None of that, of course, he did in these letters. In fact, he confided that he felt absolutely worthless. The end came suddenly for Wright Vincent. He was struck by smallpox. Interestingly enough, his brother, who was not in the army for some reason, tried to convince him to desert. Wright Vincent refused to do that. He was hit by smallpox. He was, of course, confined, separated from the rest of his army. And during that time, he spoke another letter. He spoke a letter to a hospital attendant who was barely literate himself. Wright Vincent said that he had the picture of his wife and that all he would do was look at it, and he said he thought that it would speak to him. He was so worried about his family that he might contaminate them with smallpox that he told this attendant, right, that he would have to write it. He would have to put it in the envelope. He would have to put the stamp on it, that he would have to send it back to his family because he did not want to infect his household. Some people might see Wright Vincent as just another poor Confederate who was duped by the Confederacy, or I should say duped by slaveholders. That is a question I raise with my students time and time again. It's an important and it's a powerful question. Why, in fact, do men go to war when it appears that they often are not fighting for their own interest? So Wright Vincent just seems like another just sort of dumb Confederate who followed blindly these slaveholders. And of course, he ultimately gave his life for a nation that was not his. I think semi-literate Confederates should remind us that they knew exactly what this war was about. They knew about the forces that were arrayed against them. And above all else, they recognized and spoke about the constraints that were imposed upon them to act out their own political interest. The question as to why men fought and why they stayed in the ranks is an important and powerful one, and we could spend a lot of time talking about it. But let's just hit the obvious real quickly. Coercion and force, it's always there. That's a man being bucked, of course, and gagged. And then we see, of course, a man who's tied to a wheel. We also know that there was executions as well. There is brute physical force. It permeated the ranks of both armies. It's always there. But there was also forms of coercion that were less violent, a little bit more subtle, and we often overlook them. And discourse is one of those forms of coercion. Now listen, this is about Discourse of Michel Foucault, and I see many of you right now looking toward the exit doors. It's locked on the outside. You cannot escape. You know, when someone says to me, I really understand Foucault, I'm immediately suspicious of them, right? Or if they don't like Twix candy bars, I'm also suspicious of them as well. Those are the two things I live by. Foucault's important. I don't pretend to get all of it, but I think it does matter here. And Foucault in Discourse is simply this. It's about the power of language, the power of words that are expressed in a public form. Because when it's expressed in a public form, it is intended to do what? To control and shape behavior. It is effective, discourse is, because it speaks to people's understandings of the world. And so we use discourse all the time today as discussion. I think that's a misuse of it. Discourse is about official, and I'm going to stress that to you all, official language, official messaging. All right, so here we go. What was the official discourse or messaging after Gettysburg on the Confederate side? Well, the Confederate papers made it abundantly clear that Gettysburg was not a wholesale defeat, but it was a setback. And that, we'll get tired of looking at Foucault here. How about the Richmond paper? Setback in Pennsylvania, and when Lee's army turned to Virginia, there was the belief that they would reassert their mastery over the Union armies, and that this setback in Pennsylvania, it was a test It was a test. It was going to be a test of the nation. It was a test that God was putting to the southern people. But it was a test that the southern people would ultimately pass because they would show themselves to be true to God, and to be true to God and to have faith was to also believe in the southern nation. The point of Discourse ultimately in the post-Gettysburg period was to remind Confederate soldiers in particular that they must be disciplined, deferential, dutiful, and not just to the southern nation, but to God. Here's an example of Discourse. This is General Lee's General Order of August 1st, 1863, when desertion was surging in Lee's army. He wrote this: "To remain at home in this hour of our country's need is unworthy of the manhood of a Southern soldier. While you proudly boast that you belong to the Army of Northern Virginia, let it be said that you deserted your comrades in a contest in which everything you hold dear is at stake." Again, please take in those words and note this. Did R.E. Lee threaten to use brute force? Didn't even mention execution. What did he use? What was his weapon? It was the weapon of shame. The weapon of shame to inspire men to do their duty. He questioned their manliness and suggested that if they fled, they were betraying their comrades. And above all else, he says, that very last line, that you need to do what? Everything that you hold dear is at stake. That's family, that's home, and of course that's the institution of slavery. There's Discourse, official messaging at work. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at some reactions to this. It's extraordinarily varied in Lee's army. I am not here today to try to make an argument that most men felt this way, acted this way. I'm not at all interested in questions of morale. I think that question sidesteps what's really at stake here. It's an issue of a recognition of power. How these Confederate soldiers who survived Gettysburg, how they are recognizing power within that physical situation that they inhabited. So we're going to talk about 4 men pretty quickly here. I've got about 10 minutes. And I think you're going to see this. You're going to see this in these examples. You're going to see how these men both challenged and accepted Confederate authority. Challenged and accepted Confederate authority. And finally, what you're going to see is that these men were not unthinking pawns of the Confederate ruling class. First is, it's a great name. Oh, and I should note, all from private voices. This is Ebenezer Coggin. He's in the 47th Alabama. I fought over by Little Round Top. He writes this. Oh, you change it. There we go. The rich man has got all the poor men in a place where we can't help ourselves, and we have to do the best we can. I hope that we will have our day yet before we die. If the Yankees is going to subjugate us, I wish it would be done before the sun sets tonight. Ooh. Because of time, and we can come back to any of these, I want some opportunity to have a conversation with you all. But I'll just again say this. R.E. Lee wanted his men to see themselves as a band of brothers. As we can see here, that sense of solidarity. Well, this Coggins, is it Coggin is here? Yes, Coggin. He obviously sees different class interests at work. I just want to make this final point. I get weary of people who say, well, there really wasn't class consciousness among Confederate soldiers, because if there had been, we would see this language employed of rich versus poor, or we would have seen poor soldiers rising up and rebelling in the ranks. That is what we impose upon them. That's not part of their reality. It's not part of the language that was really at their disposal. Hell, they're not reading Karl Marx and Das Kapital, are they? No, that's ridiculous. And it is ridiculous, again, to expect that somehow they would have come together in a collective way and would have been expressed their interest in an insurgency against Confederate authority. That's beyond the pale. It's having that same expectation for enslaved people. We all thankfully have reached the point where we understand that enslaved people were more than disgruntled being owned by white folks. But we also understand now that they could not, for a variety of complex reasons, just rise up. So we want to try to understand those constraints, and I think Mr. Coggin does just that. I feel very much like starting home sometimes when I get about half enough to eat. I mean, look at these little passages. That line, I could just keep reading that. How telling is that? Right? There's his physical world. That's what he's waking up to every morning. He is hungry. He is weak. He might have has a lot of resentment against the Confederate cause, but doesn't even have the physical strength to act upon that. I get enough to eat and get to studying how this thing is going on. It makes me feel like somebody was to blame and not me. I'm innocent of having anything to do to bring this war on and don't feel right suffering here as I do on account of somebody else's misdoings. Man, there is a man who feels entrapped. This is a man who feels helpless. Here is a man who is striving to identify his oppressor. He is stuck and he knows it and he knows other people are to blame but does not know how to act upon it. But above all else, it is the silence. It is the silence. He is saying he's suffering. Is there anything noble about that? Does he feel like that the separation from his home, the empty belly, that's all for some purpose, for some cause? No. He thinks it's pointless. Jonathan Coghill, he was in Iverson's brigade. You all know they suffered that horrible disaster on July the 1st. He wrote at length about losing one of his best friends in that battle. And on August 16th, he wrote, "The report is that North Carolina is going back into the Union. I exclaimed, never, no, never. That would ruin her, and she would be trampled upon by both South and North, and everything that she possesses would be destroyed. I'd rather, I think probably live, under the Emperor of France than old Lincoln. He says nothing but the restoration of the Union or our subjugation will cause peace. I hope that he will not get his once, but I'm sorry to say that our boys are deserting almost every night." I give you this example to show you that not all semi-literate Confederates took an oppositional stance to the Confederacy. I want to show you the power of discourse again. Do you see that even this poorly educated soldier uses the word what? Subjugation. That's straight from R.E. Lee. That's straight from what newspaper editors, politicians, ministers, that's what they were speaking about. What defeat would mean. Subjugation, a loss of manliness. William Wagner. William Wagner participated in the evening assault against Cemetery Hill. He was slightly wounded. He's from Catawba County, which is in the Piedmont area of North Carolina. He was a blacksmith and a farmer and a non-slaveholder. He saw plenty of men deserting after Gettysburg. He, in fact, was actually embraced that they were doing that, and in fact was tempted to do it himself. I should also note that all the men that I have read letters from, these four men, none of them deserted. I just want to make that point. So William Wagner on August 2nd wrote, "There was lots of wounded men drowned in the river." He's speaking of the Potomac River. He's speaking about the retreat. As you know, one of the pontoon bridges, if not both, near Williamsport were destroyed by the federal forces. So they got to the river. There's no bridge, no pontoon bridge. Coming across the river was, he says full. He means full, right? So the river's flooding. That's what he's talking about here. The river was full, and the wagons, these are ambulances now, washed down the river, and they was drowned. Can you imagine seeing that? He saw these poor wounded Confederates from Gettysburg, right, flailing about in the water, utterly helpless, drowning after experiencing what he saw at Cemetery Hill on July 2nd. Oh, it is dreadful to think how men does do. I wouldn't mind if we ever had gained anything or ever could expect to gain anything, and this is so telling, but just keep on fighting till they have all the men killed up and the big fellows have it all. What an outright rejection of Lee's words, and boy, does he pull back the curtains and give us the darkness of war. One of the last letters William Wagner wrote is this. "Dear, if I only could be at home to eat peaches." It's tempting to see William Wagner as just another homesick Johnny Reb, put his head down, plodded along, and did his duty. But Wagner's words, like those of other semi-literate Confederates, remind us that they did not keep quiet. They did not enshrine the Confederacy as a sacred nation. They did not mourn their fallen comrades as martyrs for the cause. And this is a critical point. I hope we can talk about this. I've never found a single poor Confederate who warned of an impending race war if the South was defeated. Their silence constituted a rejection of the Confederacy's official messaging. And their freewheeling writing broke down the barriers with the people back home. They spoke of war's darkness with remarkable openness, and they were not afraid to admit that the war had reduced them to an animalistic state. Many historians insist that Civil War soldiers turned inward and hid from war's tragedies, and that it was not until World War I when veterans exposed war's absurdities, denounced war's savagery, and described themselves as victims. But some 50 years earlier, semi-literate Confederates, they delivered what might be seen as the first full-blown critique of war's inhumanity. To appreciate this point, we must recognize the political nature of their private thoughts. And when we do this, the words of semi-literate Confederates like William Wagner, "Dear, if I only could be at home to eat peaches," becomes much more than a sweet longing for home. They were not the words that Lee wanted to hear from his troops. They were not the words of a diehard Confederate, but they were the words of a weary Southern soldier who envisioned peace without any regard for political outcome of the war. This was a radical stance, not driven by ideology, but nourished by the memories of home, of his beloved family, and, to use General Lee's own words, everything you hold dear is at stake. William Wagner never ate peaches with his family again. He was captured at Rappahannock Station on November 7th, 1863. He died at Point Lookout Prison on January 13th, 1864. Thank you.
For a more in-depth discussion with this speaker, go to patreon.com/addressing Gettysburg.